Well, greetings, everybody, and best for the new year to you all. And welcome to City Lights Live, the virtual iteration of the City Lights events calendar. I am your host, Peter Maravellis. And as we begin the new year, I would like to take this moment to thank all of you for your support in 2024. We had some very memorable, very compelling events, and it's your support that helps make our programming possible. So thanks from all of us here to all of you there. Much gratitude. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, aka the San Francisco Bay Area. Tonight's event is being brought to you by City Lights in conjunction with Kaepernick Press. We are delighted to kick off the season by celebrating the publication of The Bridges Yuri Built, How Yuri Kochiyama Marched Across Movements. It's by Kai Naima Williams, illustrated by Anastasia Magloire Williams. It's, of course, published by Kaepernick Press. Yuri Kochiyama was one of the 20th century's most notable freedom fighters, and Bridges Yuri Built chronicles her participation in movements organizing to bring about social change. The Bridges Yuri Built aims to inspire young readers to embrace Yuri's ethos that together we can build a bridge to a better world. So we are honored and delighted to have Kai Naima Williams with us here tonight in conversation with Katie Yamasaki. It is notable to point out that Kai is the great-granddaughter of Yuri Kochiyama. Kai is also a multidisciplinary writer and performing artist based in Harlem, New York. She is the author of 2 poetry chapbooks, He Tried to Drown the Ocean, I Waved, and also Tomorrow Maps. Her work has been featured in numerous journals and periodicals. These include Mask Magazine, Louisiana Literature, Abolish Is, amongst others. Kai's work will also be featured in the upcoming anthology, Black and Asian Feminist Solidarities, coming out from Haymarket Press this year. She is a co-founder of Eat at the Table Theater Company and has received numerous honors for her work. As mentioned, she'll be joined tonight by Katie Yamasaki. Katie is a muralist and picture book creator. She has painted more than 80 murals around the world, and her most recent book is Place Hand Here. She is also the author of Fish for Jimmy, as well as other books. She has a forthcoming book coming out in April of 2025 from W.W. Norton. It's titled Mural Island, and City Lights is going to be featuring her in our event series on March 17th. So if you are in the hood, please drop on by. You can join us for that. So to get the evening started and to say a few words at the outset, I would like to welcome now my esteemed colleague, Paul Yamazaki, the primary buyer at City Lights, to offer an opening statement. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Peter. And it's such an honor, Kai and Katie, to have you both here tonight. I think it's particularly significant that these are both so-called children's books, and that, one of our goals at City Lights is to keep an arc of history, of criticism, and of awareness going, and to start with 2 books, 2 authors, 2 artists who are working on bringing history alive for younger people is really important to us. And I think Kai wrote of Yuri that solidarity was not an ideal, but an embodied, necessary practice. And I think I've seen in both your work the embodiment of that statement, and then to see that both of you have carried on through decades of family history, and that you are arriving at these points that you're arriving now with a road out to the future is very exciting, and we're all very proud of you. So thank you very much. Yeah, and I will say no more.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Peter. Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to be here with Kai to celebrate this amazing and important book, The Bridges Yuri Built. So congratulations, Kai. It's such an important story, and I'm so glad you wrote it. And I'm curious if you wanted to start out just talking a little bit about your great-grandmother, just in case there's anybody here that might not have such an awareness of her, and a little bit about her legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to say thank you. Thank you, City Lights, Peter, Paul, Katie, for moderating. I really appreciate it. And Paul, those beautiful words as well. I was telling these guys before they opened the room that when I was a kid, I've have very fond memories of visiting City Lights when I would visit my grandma out in the Bay. So very honored to be here. but yes, so a little bit of context for who my great grandmother Yuri was. So she was a Japanese American freedom fighter and an activist who's kind of well known for participating in a number of racial justice movements, amongst others, and for entering activism through her work in the civil rights movement. I would say she's also emblematic of cross-racial solidarity as a concept, an ideal, a practice, as Paul pointed out. So she's sort of well known for her affiliations with multiple movements, organizations like the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, the Republic of New Africa, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, so a lot of civil rights movements and Black liberation movements, and also for her advocacy for political prisoners and her close relationships with political prisoners and activists such as Assata Shakur, Lolita LeBron, and I would say kind of most well known is her friendship with Malcolm X. Yeah, that's kind of I guess that's sort of Yuri in a nutshell. And then my book, The Bridges Yuri Built, is a biography that follows her Yuri's story from her upbringing in San Pedro, California, as in this sort of like very politically ambivalent, I would say apolitical childhood, through her incarceration with her family in a Japanese American prison camp during World War II, where she met her husband Bill, and then through her move to Harlem with Bill and her 6 children, where her consciousness was radicalized, and where she entered the movements and changed the trajectory of her life and my family, kind of forevermore. So that's the book. Yeah, hopefully that's like enough
That's great.
context.
Yeah, that's super helpful just for context. And I would encourage everybody to pick up a copy. It's not like your typical children's book read of 1,200 words. It's dense with really important
It's lengthy.
Yeah, it's lengthy. And it's worthwhile. It's extremely worthwhile. But I'd love to hear you talk about your process when it came to writing about someone in your family, like what the research was like when it came to discussing Yuri with different family members of different generations and varying experiences with your grandmother. And how would you contrast that with learning about Yuri from other sources? I have some experience with that working on my biography. And I know that sometimes it felt like I was hearing many versions of what I thought was a simple story. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear about what your experience was like with that.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm really grateful that we get to have this conversation, because I know that you probably did have very similar experiences to me when you were writing about your grandfather. And I do think it's a unique and like particular position, especially when writing for children. So everybody should read Katie's book about her grandfather, Shapes, Lines, and Light. But yeah, so my research process, I think there were kind of like 3 stages. Initially, I think when I knew I wanted to write this manuscript, I sat down and kind of tried to think about just globally what I knew about her, and kind of what I thought her overarching story was. And if I were going to imagine her as like a protagonist, how I wanted to characterize her, what I thought were kind of like the key touchstones of her story. And then, so that was before I wanted to do additional research. And then after I'd sort of like kind of conceptualized and thought about the stories that I've been told all my life about her, and what the sum of them was, that's when I sort of was like, all right, let me deep dive into doing some more like scholarly research. And I wanted to do that before I spoke to my family, because I think, and I'm at some point you and I can sit down and talk about this, but I do think that there was like, I felt pressure, not from my family, but just like internally, because it is a difficult assignment. You want to get it right. So I think I wanted to kind of like draft it and like write it as how I kind of instinctively thought it was before I went to people who are in my family who knew her better than I did, or for longer than I did, right? So I did the scholarly research first. And I read, I always have to plug this because so much of that was just reading Diane Fujino's political biography of Yuri called Heartbeat of Struggle, which is such an incredible book, and she's such an incredible writer. And that was a very surreal experience because, it's like I'm reading a scholarly, like academic almost text about my family, and it's removed, and like looking at them and at her as a subject. So it was kind of just like the kind of text that I would read in a AFAM class at school, or in Asian American Studies class. So I did that research and I learned a lot. And a lot of the things that I had thought were true narratives were like a more detailed or a little bit different than I thought they were. And then after that, I wrote a manuscript and I shared it with like my aunt, my grandmother, and I really just wanted to see, not only have them fact check logistically, because I definitely needed them to do that, but I think I also just wanted to know if they felt like that was a true account of the person that they knew. So yeah, there were many different approaches. Yeah, and it took a long time.
I totally relate to that. And it's like you have your editor at Kaepernick, and then you have your editors in your family.
Right.
Yes, I had
Totally.
similar experience. And how did they receive the book when it came out?
I think, well, I remember showing my parents the advanced reader's copy, and yeah, that's something like I'll cherish forever. They were very proud. Yeah, I hope I made them all feel proud. And I've been, in kind of going along this journey, I've been working so closely with my grandmother and my aunt too, working like especially closely with my grandmother to organize like events like this. So I think that's been great to be able to connect with my family through this work, and they all do this work. I mean, I think everybody contributes to Yuri's legacy in many ways. So it's nice to be able to do it like from this vantage point.
Yeah, and I don't think there could possibly be a more perfect time for her biography to be out in the world than right now. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but I think that it is so wonderful that we have this now to turn to, like, this next generation of young readers. And I'm curious about this bridge that you've built between Yuri's story and the young reader, because it's something that, plenty of adults don't know the importance of her story. And then like, what are your hopes for the book when it comes to this new generation that you're reaching? And if you can talk a little bit about your experience writing for children, which is so different than like your poetry and your theater work.
Yeah, it's so different for sure. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate this question. I've kind of talked about this before, but one thing that I really wanted children to take away from the book was, or for parents and teachers to be able to use the book as a tool to like encourage, was a sense of like empowerment and agency to get involved and participate and pursue justice and like making a difference before they grew up. I really wanted children to feel like to read the story and to hear about Yuri and to feel like they didn't need the agency of adulthood or formal education to make a difference, and to make an effort to identify what they care about and pursue that. Because something that I really wanted to, that was evident in Yuri's story, and I really wanted to capture it, which is part of why I spend so long talking about her childhood, is that before Yuri was an activist, she was active. Before she was putting herself on the front lines of movements and putting herself in these dangerous, positions, she was a community service oriented person. She, and in an apolitical way, she was a volunteer. She was a Girl Scout. She was a reporter for the school newspaper. She was she participated very much in church and taught Sunday school as well. And that instinct to serve the community and to care for people and to follow up that care with action is also the same impetus that drives her activism. So, I really wanted to show that. I think also because I grew up in a family of like people in the movement. I also went to a school that was social justice oriented, and that was born out of the civil rights movement. So I remember being taught as a child about racism, how racism is implemented systemically, legalized discrimination at like 5, 6 years old, both at home and in school through books like these, or through music, storytelling, culture, community, etc. And so when I sat down to write the book, I knew that I wanted to honor the capacity of children to understand these things. And I know it can be tricky, both as writers of books like this, where we're talking about history, and for, parents and educators. I've worked with kids, I've been a nanny, I've been a teacher, a tutor. So I know how hard it can be to explicate the realities of the world that they're going to inherit, because you don't want to discourage the optimism of children, the hope of children. But what I actually think is that information doesn't necessarily diminish a child's hope. I actually think that children are well equipped often to receive the truth and to still move in pursuit, like towards hope. So yeah, I think that was something I wanted to take away, that kids are able to be a part of these conversations and also to be a part of resistance. Yeah.
I think and I think you did that really well and kind of made that care and action kind of comparison be so synonymous. So for a kid to see like something as simple as writing letters as a way to show care,
Yes.
the letters kind of transformed through her life, and from writing to Japanese Americans fighting overseas to writing to people, political prisoners and people who are incarcerated. I think like you did a really nice job of making those actions be super relatable for a young reader. And
Thank you.
yeah, just kind of showing how much care she had. It wasn't overly complex. It was very simple, and it was kind of like, even in the way she said that she became known as the person who, if somebody went to prison, she's the first person you call when you incarcerated, and she's the first person you call when you come home. And there's a very kind of
Absolutely.
like this strong description of like when the house became too full of people who needed a home, Bill slept in the tub and Yuri slept in the crib with the baby. And I don't know more growing up in the movement than that.
Right.
Um, and what
Absolutely.
I loved about her activism is it just felt very kind of multidisciplinary. It was kind of so broadly speaking about justice. And I think that like right now we're in such a time when sometimes when bad things happen, people are kind of trained to fall into their fear and close themselves into their fear. And she kind of seemed to have this approach of kind of like charging towards justice and like opening up in a different way. And so whatever that meant, if it meant sitting down in the middle of the road in Harlem with her neighbors to take a stand, or if it meant writing these letters or supporting these political prisoners. And I feel like you are also very multidisciplinary in your art. And that just kind of seems related to me, almost like different ways of being connected. And I was just wondering if that resonates and if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. And it's interesting because I do see myself as a multidisciplinary artist, and I do see her approaches as multidisciplinary, like when you bring up the letters. the apartment, the way that she was with people, I do think that she took a lot of different approaches. But I've never made that comparison between us, or between our practices. But I do appreciate that, because I think that does resonate with me. But yeah, I've always wanted to tell stories in many different ways. I've always been attracted to many different kinds of art forms. And I do think at some point, I was very serious. I took my writing very seriously as a child. Or like there was a certain point where I decided this is what I wanted to do at a pretty young age. So I do think there was some time where I kind of felt like I had to choose, because before that, I wanted to be an actress, when I was really little. So I do think that there was a point at which I felt like I had to pick between my passions, and really apply myself to one thing. And then the joy of, being an artist in adulthood is being able to work across these mediums and to express myself and tell my stories in a variety of ways. But I also think, to the point of your question, like, I think a lot of that probably is because of the family that I was raised in, because there's so many artists in my family. And there's so many activists for whom art is a discipline and a practice, or artists for whom activism is also a way of life, and a way of being. So there was always those intersections between art and activism, art and culture and revolution. Like, my dad is a fashion designer. Before that, and concurrently, he is a graffiti writer. My grandmother on my mother's side is a visual artist. He's also an activist. And we have like writers and other types of artists in my family. So I think that I was like nurtured in an environment where I was very lucky, because I think I was always told like I could do whatever I wanted. As long as there was like a purpose. So yeah, I mean, and that probably is a result of Yuri, who was also a great patron of the arts. I mean, not like financially speaking, but she was a supporter of artists. And so I think that, probably there's a lot to do. The fact that my family is made up of artists and activists, I think, Yuri deserves a lot of credit for that as well.
And it seems like it is the most natural relationship, right? Art with activism, because otherwise, what are you saying? And
Totally.
I love just kind of like the way you describe growing up in the movement, surrounded by artists and activists, and how, I remember when I was kind of early in my career, I was trying to figure out like how to make a living, how to, be an artist, how to be a teacher. And like I had all of these different jobs. I at different times had like 6 part-time jobs. I would teach, then I'd go work on a mural after school, then I'd like work at a gym at night. And, it was like every day was like that. And I felt like my life was so segregated. And then I had this conversation with actually Bay Area muralist who I really admire, Brett Cook Disney. And he said, it's not about like putting away enough time for your art. It's just about building this creative life, and I think that really resonated, because, and it reminded me of this story, because it's kind of like this whole life that includes everything. And I think that like what is so interesting to me, just coming from also a Japanese American family on my father's side, like looking at Bill and Yuri's relationship from this perspective of, a bit of distance, but how they met at camp and like, at a dance, and then how their dynamic, like the role that Bill may have played, and how it was this whole family movie, movement, and which isn't really typical for Japanese marriage of that generation, at least not in my family, and not kind of like what I've seen before. And yeah, Paul also, it's just that he would be in the bathtub if there were so many people who needed a place to sleep. All the beds and the couches were full. And yeah, and there's a great illustration by Anastasia showing like the Japanese family living in community in Harlem, kind of at the center of Black culture. And I just wonder if you could speak a little bit to like the family dynamic in the context of that energy and the activism and the culture surrounding Harlem at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I'm gonna take out my earrings because I'm worried they're like hitting my AirPods in a way that's making noise. Um, yeah, I think Yuri and Bill's dynamic is so interesting. And a little bit of a mystery to me still. I knew my grandma Yuri died when I was 16, but I never knew my grandpa Bill, so I never saw them interact. But that was something that I think was just like really interesting because like Yuri entered movements, uh she entered movements after their move to Harlem, at which point they'd already had 6 children and she was middle-aged. So she was never a housewife because they both always worked to support their family. Uh, but I do think like that must have been such a shift because before before her entry into movements, like I do think probably their family was more typical. And then at some point, not only does she decide I'm going to be this activist, everyone in the family is mandated to join her in this, right? Like it's not like that was for the Kochiyamas, like you were going to participate. So it changes the entire trajectory of their family's position in Harlem, which was also just like already unconventional because they were one of the only like Asian American and Japanese American people in their neighborhood, in their housing project. Um, and then she also becomes like this public facing person for the first time, and a leader, even though I don't think she'd identify herself as such. Um, so I do think that that was just like interesting that Bill was, you know, so supportive and aligned with that. But also like not that he took the back seat. I don't necessarily think that's the right terminology. But that, you know, she took this position that was more front facing. So I do just think that's like such an interesting change from what it could have been. But interestingly enough, I think she kind of operated outside of gender roles like
Mhm.
for a lot of her life. Like when she was a child, she had 2 brothers, a twin and an older brother, but she was not expected to like do housework or like I think she was like equally outside as them, if not more so, which is something I read in Diane's book, which I just thought was so interesting because it's like I don't know why like her family was cool with that, but it to me it sounds like that's unusual for a Japanese American family in the 1920s. So I think she kind of like maybe somehow have just evaded those kinds of structures. But yeah, I think, you know, the Kochiyamas had such an interesting, you know, my grandma and her siblings, Yuri and Bill's children, I think had like such an interesting upbringing in Harlem. Like you said, you know, like you mentioned, they opened their house and were giving shelter to anyone who needed it. And a lot of the times those were you know, people who were like on the run and needed to safe harbor. So yeah, I think they have just like a very unconventional story for sure.
Yeah, and you know, sometimes in the book it kind of came across that she had a certain clarity that was
Hmm.
like, this is a gap that needs to be filled. This is a like, and in the language of like your title, like this is a bridge that needs to be built. Like these people
Yeah.
need receiving letters, or these people need to be receiving basic services, or you know, whatever it is. Like there's a very straightforward way to get from A to B, and it seemed like she saw that with a lot of clarity. And something else that I wondered about, you know, from the very beginning of the book, you know, when she was, I think, 20 and her father died, tragically, he was
Hmm.
arrested the night of Pearl Harbor by the FBI, which was the exact same thing that happened to my great grandfather, arrested that night with, you know, the FBI came to the door and they rounded up hundreds of men, Japanese men on the West Coast. And then they took your great grandfather or your great great grandfather, I guess, to
Hmm.
one of these military prisons. And then he died 3 weeks later. That
Yeah.
is just so brutal. And you, I think you really, in such a poignant way, express her grief there. And then there's another part of the story later where you express the grief that she experienced when Malcolm died and how she was, you know, she was the one, this is such an iconic image, but she was the one on the stage holding his head as he breathed his last breath. And like when
Mhm.
everybody was running away from the bullets, from the shots fired, she's running towards them. And I wonder like how grief was maybe I don't know if this is the right word, but if grief was motivating for her, you know, and because I always think about like when people are so compelled to action, you know, there's like often a motivating emotion behind it, whether it's like clarity, you know, it could be clarity, it could be just a general sense of justice. but there are some really profound moments of grief in the story. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. And also if you have any
Yeah.
kind of like motivating emotions behind your own work.
Yeah, no, I think that's completely true. And actually, wow, I feel like I want us to like continue to do engagements together because I didn't even really think about it like that, but those are the two kind of like turning point moments of this, at least of Bridges. I think, I think that she was motivated by grief in that, and both of those are situations in which, although she maybe didn't understand what happened to her father as this at the time, they are both murders.
Mhm.
And they are both such unjust situations. So I think Yuri was always compelled to respond to injustice, and that maybe the grief of losing someone to it is maybe the most profound feeling that can come of that. But Malcolm's assassination certainly, and I tried to kind of, because I had to end the book there because there just wasn't room. I really tried to emphasize that drove her down a path she was already, forging, but like really was part of what she wanted to do was to honor him by continuing the fight. So I do think that grief was incredibly motivating for her. Um, Maybe somewhat similarly, I don't know, but I think for my own writing, um, I think, well, I'm a very emotional person. And I think when my emotions are like at their most heightened, writing is comes most naturally because I think a lot of, especially my poetry, but a lot of my best or like truest writing is the stuff that comes easily because I am like record keeping, because I am writing in response to something that I'm feeling or something that is making me feel a certain way. So I think for me, probably the most motivating emotions have been both like a love, um, not just romantic, but a lot of, especially in my second chapbook and in my first, um, although my first chapbook is like it gives 19-year-old. It's very emotional in like a cornier way, but
There's space for that though.
there's space for that. We're gonna hold space for that. But so much of my poetry and my favorite poems of mine are kind of like odes to like my chosen families and uh my friends because especially when I was like discovering poetry in college or writing poetry for the first time in college, like I think my love of them and like how much I just loved watching them and like being around them made it very easy to just do that record keeping. Like I just always wanted to write about them. So I think that because that love was like the most heightened emotion, it was the easiest thing to kind of just respond to. So I would say love, and then I would also say anger, because I think some of the like poetry that I've written, or not just poetry, but some of the things that I've published that it seems like people resonate the most with are written from like a place of rage, usually thinking about political happenings, but also coming from lived experience or like the experience of my communities. So yeah, I think both of those, both love and anger, I think are kind of like some of the most heightened things you can feel. Yeah, so I think I would say that.
I'll be so interested, like now that I know you, just to kind of like follow you through your decades, and see how this is a thread and what other threads kind of get woven in. Because
Absolutely.
besides your book, I've just been loving your poetry, and
Thank you.
so yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. And I know that I really related to the grief piece with Yuri because I know for me, like I do a lot of work with people who are incarcerated. So, and the first time was, about 15 years ago, I was working in a women's prison in Mexico, and I really connected with it, but not. on such a personal level, just more like kind of stunned by the situation of the mass incarceration of women and the impact of
Yeah.
their immediate families and their broader communities. And then in like 2015, I was doing a mural in New Orleans for Amnesty International, and it was like a campaign for this woman, Teodora del Carmen Vasquez, who had been incarcerated in El Salvador because when she was 9 months pregnant, she had her child, her baby had been stillborn, and then she had
Mm.
been charged with infanticide and sentenced to
Oh
30
my God.
years in prison. So by the time I was doing this mural for her, she had already been incarcerated for 11 years. Amnesty was
Oh
taking her
my
case
God.
and trying to get her out, and I was at that time 7 months pregnant with our son. And then 2 months later, after the mural was done, the campaign was done, our son was also stillborn. And I remember being in the hospital and being like, it's kind of, surrounded by all of this care, all of these doctors and all of these, my family, and like thinking like, how is it possible that when she was in the situation, she was arrested,
Mm.
like at this, and I remember just thinking about my grief and how that to this day is the worst thing that I've ever experienced. And she was criminalized for it, and so I know for me, like that was, 10 years ago, and it's led to like 10 years of very intensive work in correctional facilities with women in particular. But it's interesting, when I read about Yuri's father and then read about like just being there when Malcolm was shot, like how we're all moved by different moments in our life to connect. And I think with Yuri, what I loved about reading more about her legacy was just seeing how she used her all that she had, her natural energy, but and also her grief, and then kind of her experiences in the prisons, and like to deepen her connection with people at large, not to go into this now we have to protect ourselves, but to see like, who else can I help?
Yeah.
How else can I further open my door? Who else can get a letter? I would feel like you really got that point home so well. And to that point, I was wondering like what role you feel Japanese Americans can play and others who are impacted by mass incarceration of our people in history, but just like our people, today. Because sometimes it feels like
Yeah.
there's such a removal from like the mass incarceration that happened in World War II to mass incarceration
Sure.
today. So I would love to hear from you on that.
Yeah. Thank you. That's such a good question. Yeah, I think of a few things, I guess. First would be that I think, it is beneficial and important for, anyone, regardless of our race, ethnicity, history, um, to examine the ways that the prison industrial complex at large is harmful, and not just mass incarceration, but that entire sort of system. Um, but I do think that something specific to Japanese Americans that I would suggest is that when we look at our history, the history of our incarceration in these camps, um, I feel like a lot of the times when we talk about the injustice, we talk about the fact that it was unjust for our people to be imprisoned, derailed, denied freedom, uh, on the basis of their race and ethnicity, right? These circumstances outside of our control, and not because crimes had been committed. But what I want for Japanese Americans is that when we think about that history, um, we don't differentiate between what happened to us and the circumstances around our incarceration and incarceration in general. Because I do think that sometimes when we talk about this history, there's this emphasis on the fact that like we did not do anything to deserve this, right? Like no crimes were committed, or we may have been accused of them, but generally speaking, it wasn't about individual action. But I also want people to engage with the idea that there are issues with incarceration even when crimes are committed. and to really think about the circumstances that perpetuate the systems of crime and punishment on both sides, and how it's inextricable from race and racism, regardless of if it's something like what happened to us, or if it's just more of a general way of looking at like policing and imprisonment. Because I do think that Japanese American communities have spoken up and spoken out. I think about like in 2016, when there were conversations about like registering Muslim people and putting Muslim people in camps. I feel like Japanese American communities spoke out. Or, I think that when we talk about undocumented children being imprisoned, and immigrant people being imprisoned in these like camps or in these sites, that Japanese American communities speak out. But I don't want our focus to be on the idea that people should not be imprisoned on the basis of religion or ethnicity or these factors of identity beyond our control. That's true. People shouldn't be imprisoned for those reasons. But I want Japanese Americans to also take that step further and think about questioning, should people be imprisoned at all? What are alternatives? And I know that not everyone is an abolitionist. But I do encourage people to research what prison abolition is, and to try to educate themselves on why people fight for it, because I think it's easy for us to concur that mass incarceration is wrong. But I also think that people should try and take the step further to question, is any type of incarceration right? And if you do believe that, like, why? So I think just engaging with that practice of questioning, but trying not to make these divisions or relying on these conditions when we talk about the conversations of what happened to our people and our incarceration, and then incarceration as a general conversation.
That bigger question of, when does punishment really work?
Yes.
And when do we benefit by perpetuating harm? Yeah.
Absolutely.
I always think about too, just like the generational impact of when you tell any group of people that their life has no value, what the long-term impact is of that, what people pass down to their children. I spend a lot of time right now thinking about like all of the families who have recently migrated to New York City. We've got like a shelter a few blocks away with 3,000 people, and the trauma of the journey, the trauma of their current treatment, their living situation, children who are riding their parents back on the subway to sell candy, like what is the generational trauma that's going to come from this, so
absolutely,
just like, not carceral, but it is this kind of thing about what, why it is that there is this way of kind of devaluing a human life,
Yeah. Detaining people, and absolutely, yeah.
When there's we're kind of, I think a little bit lower on time, so I'm like in between this Toni Morrison and your poem. I'm going to do both just really quick.
Okay, yeah.
There's a Toni Morrison quote that I think is really relevant to the time that we're in right now, and I also think it's just really relevant to Yuri. And it's I don't know that I have it exactly right, but it's something like, when you're stuck with the why, then go to the what, and that feels a lot right now today, with the fires, with the political state, with anything really, with the migrant crisis. And it is an overwhelming time, and I wonder what Yuri would do. What do you do? Yeah.
Well, I just want to say I love that quote, and I'm so glad you brought that, because I think you have a really great sense of Yuri and understanding of her, because I feel like that does perfectly resonate and sum up her work, because before Yuri understood anything about why certain injustices were happening, she was motivated by the impulse or the instinct to just participate. Like, she could understand that something was right or wrong without understanding why or how those things were perpetuated and working and functioning. And she then did the education and got herself educated through like going to a freedom school. But the what was so much more important to attend to. The why was also important to understand, but attending to the what was most important. And so I think in thinking about today, I think another thing that you can kind of take from Yuri's example is that I do think that there can be kind of like a pressure socially today, before you involve yourself in like activism, organizing, community work, to like really feel like you have to be well researched, to really feel also that you have to like look inward, I guess, and think about like your privileges, your positionality, like are you going to occupy space in a way that's wrong? And like all of these things are, I think, so calibrated inward, you know, which I think is like a product of like the way in which we like engage online and things like that. And I'm going to get abstract, so I won't go too far down that rabbit hole. But I think that like what Yuri would do is just jump in and worry not about herself, and whether she had the right to be in certain places. She still, you know, didn't position herself as a leader, like she was going to take control of a room, or, you know, speak without being asked to. It was always in support of the what, and support of communities that she was there to protect and help. But she wasn't worried about like waiting until she was educated, waiting until she understood like what space she should take up or not, because she was an Asian woman in these like predominantly Black spaces often. So I think that is something we can try to apply now, is just to really try to participate in whatever the causes are that we want to participate in, and to try to create spaces for each other as well too, where more people can come in and participate instead of, you know, excluding. So I think there's that. I also think just being in community, finding the communities of people that you want to be around, and especially in this time and in the next 4 years and however many more, when our governments are not supporting us and when they're actively oppressing and suppressing us, you know, how do we create spaces to give to one another and to protect each other outside of those structures? Yeah.
I love that. And it's so kind of embodied, you know, it's like the participation and the protection is so kind of physical, kind of, yeah, I love that. And I also think it's kind of what she would, you know, what she would want us to do, participate. And I think it's also in the title of your book, you know, it's the bridge build the bridges.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm going to just wrap up with a quote from one of your poems, and I highly recommend to everybody that you check out Kai's website. She has some very beautiful work on there, both video and poetry. And this is from a poem called Radical Imagination, and I'm sure she will read it better, but I'm just going to read it and then ask you to.
Of course.
And I am in us, a mixture of countries and blood that met as comrades and created the same children. My ancestors come to my candle, whisper. We suffered different beneath the same rule, but our resistances rub shoulders, and and the shared muscle is you. And I feel like, Kai, you are the shared muscle. And I just, when I read that, I just felt like that is such a beautiful way to put it. And it is like you were just saying, it's that embodiment and that kind of participation. But if you want to, I would love to hear your response to your words and what you're thinking.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. And I think that you too are the shared muscle. And so I'm happy that resonated with you. Yeah, I guess I'll just say really quickly that I wrote that poem. I was commissioned by an organization, I think that's based in California, maybe the Bay Area, called Densho. And their mission is to, you know, tell the stories and keep the history of Japanese American incarceration in World War II. And I was commissioned to write that poem in the summer of 2020. So this was also during the George Floyd uprisings. So I was feeling a lot of anger. And I was also thinking a lot about the past being present. So that poem, Radical Imagination, is where I envision a future in which we're in a new country, post United States, and we have buried the emperors, and liberated ourselves and each other. And I talk about shared history and the interconnectedness of struggle. But I wrote that particular section, the candle, my ancestors come to my candle whisper, because I couldn't write the poem for a really long time. I was like, you know, panicking because I had the deadline and I didn't know what to say. I had so much I wanted to say and nothing was coming out. Nothing was happening. And yeah, I was like having panic attack. And then I lit a candle and I said to Yuri, and to my ancestors, you know, my ancestors are also descendants and you know, people who were Black Americans who were enslaved, you know, in Mississippi. And then I have Jewish family. My mother is half Jewish, you know, who came to this country because they were escaping the Holocaust. And you know, and then there's the Japanese Americans. So I was thinking about all these different lineages of entrapment. So I lit the candle and I just asked, speak through me, like tell me what to say. And that's what I heard. So then the entire poem is just, I think I wrote the whole poem in one go while that candle was burning, and then was like, okay, I guess that's it. So yeah.
It's an amazing
Thank
poem.
you.
I love it so much.
Thank you so much.
I feel like it embodies so much of like your work and Yuri's work and just the whole everything that came about to make you and everything you're bringing to the world now.
Thank you.
And I think yeah, I think that probably wraps it up from my end. Peter,
yeah, we've got some questions coming through in the chat. Let's see. So Joe comments, first, thank you all for creating a safe space here. My mom's parents met at Rower with my grandpa serving in the Army as a Nisi translator and my grandma working on the newspaper at camp. They both converted from Buddhism to Christianity, but it is a mystery how that happened. I am someone that has wrestled with Christianity since childhood, given its colonial and abusive history. I have reached a point now where I follow Jesus in my own way, but struggle to integrate. How would you say Yuri bridged her Christianity and her political activism? Kai, what are your thoughts on Christianity and faith's role in political activism?
Yeah, well, first of all, really, really interesting to hear about your family at Rower, because so Yuri was in Jerome, but Jerome Rower, they're both in Arkansas. I think they're connected. I actually went to Rower this summer with my aunt and cousins on a Japanese American pilgrimage. So that's just really interesting. You know, I also have that question about Yuri because I don't think, and maybe my family will correct me on this later, but I think at some point she did lose access to her Christianity because she also did convert to Islam at some point. So I think that was tied in with her political beliefs. So I do think that there was a disillusionment with Christianity at some point, even though that she was very religious for the first portion of her life. And they celebrated Christmas. So I'm not quite clear on when she her religious views and her faith changed. But I know that she became a Muslim for some time due to like her political affiliation with members of the movement and organizations, like a lot of whom were Muslim. So I'm not actually sure when that happened, or I know that when she was, however, incarcerated in those prison camps, she called on she taught Sunday school. We didn't really get into this, but a lot of her first kind of like action program was born out of having the girls in her Sunday school class write letters to Nisei soldiers, and then that spread and became like an enormous campaign. So I think that she probably did use her faith to understand the world, and also to highlight how she wanted to be in service to others. I'm not really sure when exactly that disillusionment happened. I don't know that I am like someone who can really speak to, well, specifically Christianity, because I didn't grow up religious, and that place, right, in movements. But I do think faith and political action can coincide. I mean, I think, as you said, like it's really difficult when there are colonial histories attached to these things. But I think, like any belief system, it's individual and probably can be carried and help, like have people can hold space for that in a variety of ways. But I didn't grow up religious, so I haven't really gone through having to kind of like navigate that those philosophies.
Can I add just a little bit? I was just in terms of
Please.
the part of the question where you were kind of wondering where the Christianity came from, like how that happened. I know, like on with my family at least, so much of the social life and so much of the social life was built around the Christian church. So like also my family was Buddhist
Mm.
Christianity, and I think you know the English language classes, the like dances, you know, a lot of the life was built around the church. And then just in terms of kind of like Christianity and political activism on my mother's side, my grandparents were both Catholic workers, so they were introduced by Dorothy Day at a Catholic worker house in Vermont. So that, and if you look at the Catholic worker movement, that is kind of like a very rugged a way of living, to kind of, you take a pledge of poverty and you devote your life to living to serve, you know. And so that's she's an interesting kind of political Christian model as well, Dorothy Day, if you check her out.
Mm.
If I can bring
Thank you for
Paul
that.
into the discussion, because Paul, was it your grandfather who was a minister?
It was my dad's father. He converted in Japan before he came to the United States.
Wow.
And so the church that the Nakaharas went to, like, you know, Pete and Mary at that time, that was my grandfather's church that he founded. And then for the first 50 years of that particular church, it only had Yamazakis for rectors. Thankfully, that chain has been broken.
You made sure of that.
Yeah.
So we have another comment in the chat. Tommy says, this conversation filled me with joy and courage. Thank you, Kai and Katie. Very grateful for what you shared tonight. Actually, I have a question of my own. You know, focusing on the book itself and the process of creating this really beautiful tome, if you could talk a little bit about what it was like working with the artist and
Yeah.
how you managed. I mean, it must not have been easy to put this puzzle together, because there's so much more that you could probably have included.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. It was actually really a struggle because I had so many different like ideas for how it might go in terms of picking and choosing what stayed in and what didn't. Because I kind of end the book right before or like right as she's becoming the person that she ended up being. So a lot of the like really cool actions that like she's well known for, I didn't get to include, but I did that because I thought it was important to talk about her journey of becoming and, you know, how she reached that place, and not just what she achieved, but what were the circumstances that created the person that was able to achieve those things. So it was really tricky to pick and choose. But working with Anna was amazing. This is the first time I've done a picture book, children's book. I've never written for children before. It was completely and it's, even though I published chapbooks with like small independent poetry presses, this was like my first like big deal publishing project, right? So everything was new to me, including working with an illustrator. But it was really great because it was just like, it's just an amazing thing to have someone take your work and your words. And yeah, it was actually like quite a collaborative process, which I wasn't really expecting. We sat down and went through every kind of like stanza basically. And she said, well, this is what I'm envisioning. Like, what do you think? And I really like appreciated that she wanted my opinion, because as I told her, like, I was like, this is all you, because I'm not a visual person. And, you know, I don't know really how to articulate, like, I didn't really have the language or vocabulary for like, oh, I want things to look like this kind of thing. But she really like was so gracious in letting me have input. And So I did kind of like work with her and saying like, oh, like, for example, like there's a shot, certain things that I wanted to show, like the fact that she works on her ironing board. She, instead of a desk, she writes on her ironing board. That was like a detail I love about Yuri, and it's true. So I was like, oh, can you switch this desk for an ironing board? Or, you know, when her dad dies, like, can we just show the altar? Because in the homes that I grew up in, you know, we always have an altar for like our ancestors and people who have passed. So I was like, I contributed in that way, but you know, it's just magic. Like just having someone being able to do that is incredible to me. So she was lovely, and I'm really lucky to have gotten to work with her.
Yeah. Katie, could you show us that one more time, what you just flashed? Because I don't think the audience got to see that.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's Yuri's father, in the page where I'm talking about his passing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Paul, you've been sitting by. Do you have any comments? We're coming up on the top of the hour, but I wanted to give you a
I
chance.
do. I think I want to thank Katie and Kai for such an amazing conversation. And I think, you know, what was really important about it is it gave us all a foundation to what I would call critical joy. And just that it's that, and despite everything that's going on around the planet, in this country, politically, culturally, environmentally, that, you know, that there is a path forward. And I love the fact that both of you refuse to be defeated or to even think about that, but to move forward and to think about it critically, not to blind yourself, but to actually give us more clarity of how we move forward. So I thank you both very, very much for this. It's a great gift for
Thank
all
you.
of us.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
And I can't think of a better way to really begin the winter season. And this has been wonderful. Kai,
Yes.
congratulations on a
Thank you.
beautiful, engaging, very exceptional book. And thank you, Katie, for doing the honors. And
Thank you, Katie.
It's an honor for
Yes.
me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you both.
Paul, thank you for those good words at the outset and all the way through. I would like to also thank all of you in the audience for joining us. I would like to remind you we have posted links with which you may purchase books. Also, please subscribe to the City Lights newsletter. If you haven't already, you'll get to stay informed about everything that's happening around here. There's quite a bit going on. We're also a publisher as well as a bookstore. We're publishing several publications this season. One of those is a new book by the fabulous Brandon Shimoda. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement in books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and our educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So best of the new year to you all. Keep warm and dry. Take care. Stay strong. We hope to see you all again very soon.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. It means a lot.
It's a wonderful book. I'm so
No,
glad.
thank you.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you. I feel the same way about yours.
You
all
get,
right.
it really was kind of, I think at this particular moment, but at the fact that, you know, you could, and it would be another kind of topic of discussion about how you stay not defeated and given everything that keeps piling up on us, and like, you know, just
I think
and the
like
fact that you continue to work, you know, just and engage with, like, you know, communities that really.
I think like when I go to the prison every Tuesday, and like when I'm with my students, I feel like with all the privileges I have, that I do not have the right to be like buried in cynicism, you know, because like they're there, you know,
Yeah.
and they like, you know, it just feels like, and they're not being buried in cynicism, you know, they're doing this work. I have a student who became a doula this past year, you know, I have students who they're making all of this art, they're getting their master's degrees, you know, and they're in a maximum security women's prison, you know.
Wow.
Yeah, like it's not for me to be cynical, you know. It's
I
like,
feel that.
yeah, I gotta keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, that's the gift of active work, and you know, and a lot of people don't have that, and that's why it's so important for people like yourselves who are both doing active work with across broad communities, as well as engaging in your own art, and how those two things intersect is so important for other people to hear. You know, to
Oh,
kind
thank
of
you so much. Thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. I feel like doing this work too has like just been so inspiring and like yeah, it's just I mean Yuri is just such an interesting person that I always like I don't know, I just feel energized when I'm like researching or reading talking about her. Thank you
well,
guys so much. I'm gonna hop off because I haven't eaten
okay.
yet and it's
Alrighty.
10 p.m. over here.
Okay, that's very
I know
good night for you.
no, it's okay. That was my own doing. I just could never eat before an event because I get nervous. But thank you so much. This was so lovely. I appreciate you all so much. I'm really glad we got to do it this way. And hopefully see you soon.